Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to disaster recovery, business continuity, emergency management, lessons learned, COVID, well-being, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me at LinkedIn. I am the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. Today, I'm going to welcome back Christine Miller. Christine, welcome back.
Thanks, Alex.
And we're going to talk about something, at least the acronym I had not heard of up this way, OIL. But it's not the kind of oil people think it is. It's a little bit different. It's related to lessons learned in emergency management, right? And that's what you're going to talk to us about. But first of all, obviously, the obvious question is, what does OIL stand for?
Indeed, Alex. So I prepared a little presentation to just give us a few slides to share.
Sure.
Here we go. Hopefully you're seeing slides in a moment.
Yeah, I am.
We
Our Voice America listeners, unfortunately, you won't be able to see the slides, but Chris is going to talk us through everything that is on them. So,
obviously. And just to introduce myself, since I may not be as well known globally as I seem to be in Australasia, I'm the National Vice President of the Australasian Institute of Emergency Services. And I've been in emergency management for more than 50 years. I did start very young. And so I've become very interested in how we can do better in the emergency and business continuity space. I've been specialising in business continuity for the past 16 years. So what's OIL? And when I first suggested to Alex that we do this segment, I was thinking that we'd be talking about taking OIL to Africa. And I'll come back to that point. So OIL is observations, insights, lessons identified, lessons learned. That's where we get the acronym OIL. But bearing in mind that lessons are not learned until changes are made. Mm-hmm. And that OIL fits within the greater umbrella or fabric of lessons management. Now, many of us who've run business continuity exercises, emergency management exercises, near misses, incident reviews, after action reviews, post-incident reviews, mid-action reviews, whatever you call it.
There's lots of words for it.
Yes, you will have captured many ideas about what we did well and what we did less well. And so you're bombarded with all this information. And what are you going to do with it? How are you going to make good use of this? So that perhaps you can take the lessons you've identified and turn them into lessons learned so you don't keep falling over the same hurdles again and again and again. So where did all this come from? Not me. I certainly can't lay claim to this. It's the US Army, it appears. I'm always very interested to know where these things came from. You know, who is the instigator? And there is a book, a slim book, only about 90 pages. Most of the books I read, I'm lucky to get anything under 300 pages. But the US Army appears to have been the developer of this in 1985. And then they shared these ideas elsewhere in the defence within the United States. And then it trickled into NATO. And that's why I thought that the Canadians know all about it, because of your being a founding member of NATO. And the British Army picked it up, and then the Australian Army picked it up, because we do send exchange officers to NATO, the British Army, possibly to Canada. We send our people everywhere because we believe that there's lots we can learn from everyone else. Mm-hmm. And so off we go and try and learn these things. And we make observations, insights, lessons identified, lessons learned, and bring them back to our organisations. When I used to be a work health and safety inspector, I used to read accident reports. So I read King's Cross Station, Piper Alpha. We don't actually have any large residential oil platforms in Australia. We have smaller ones, but nothing like Piper Alpha, but nonetheless, we were trying to capture lessons. We do have some underground railway stations. So with King's Cross, we noticed that one of the problems was wooden escalators. And in Australia, we replaced all of those with metal escalators. When I worked with air crash investigators, even if the crash wasn't in Australia, we couldn't wait to see the early reports and the subsequent reports, especially if it was aircraft that we flew in Australia. So we're very good at taking lessons, taking ideas from others, bringing them back in our little rucksack to Australia, unpicking them and deciding which bits of these great ideas can we capture and move forward with.
That's what we should all do anyway.
And so it was picked up first from the Australian Army, and then they started sharing it with the emergency managers. And then it starts to trickle into business continuity, because there's people like me that are both an emergency manager and a business continuity manager. And you're absolutely right, Alex. We do need to be learning from each other at every opportunity.
That's how our we grow as individuals, our organizations grow, and our communities. Right? Hey, such and such community did this, and look at the results of what happened. Is there something we can learn from that? And I don't think that happens enough these days.
Well, O.I.L.L, the thing I like about O.I.L.L is it sort of gives you a structure around which to hang some of those observations and insights. And in my business continuity plans, for instance, I always have an incident and exercise register where we actually review what we've done with these insights we picked up in previous lessons from previous exercises, incidents, near misses and the like, and see if we move forward, because sometimes lessons of the past are superseded. We get new technology, new ways of handling them. So sometimes we don't have to make the necessary changes to move them into the lessons learned column, because the organisation may have moved on. And of course, in COVID, we've seen a lot of our organisations move on at lightning speed. Yeah. And in Australia in particular, we've seen a lot of interface between defence and emergency management and policing during COVID, but also during some of our recent floods, bushfires and various other things. And I understand you Port Evals in Canada have had a few problems around Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island with
Hurricane Fiona.
Tropical storms that went a little further north, and then they'd be welcomed. And now, of course, Hurricane Ian, that seems to have been causing a great deal of havoc around the Gulf of Mexico and Florida, and possibly moving further north, hopefully not to Canada this time.
So far it looks like we might miss it, that it's not going to impact us. And if it does, there might be a little bit of rain somewhere, but fingers crossed.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had the occasional cyclone in Australia that's come further south that will be helpful. So unfortunately, we do know what this is like, and it's not great. So we just wish everybody involved in that only the best for their prompt recovery from these difficulties.
Yes, most definitely.
And again, stressing how O.I.L.L fits into that bigger environment. So after incidents, after near misses, exercises and simulations, those after action reviews or whatever else you might call them in your organisation. And of course, during COVID, we've been doing mid-action reviews to try and capture lessons, ideas as we've been going along, to feed them into our forward plans to get ourselves in a better state of preparedness, because COVID isn't over. And of course, we may get struck again with outbreaks, variants and various other problems. So we do want to be capturing those ideas and inserting them into our plans. So when you have a very big incident, and before we came on air, we were talking about the Kangaroo Island fire off South Australia. And the after action review from that very serious fire that burnt out about half of the island. It's a significantly large island, killed a lot of koalas, unfortunately killed a couple of humans too. It was very regrettable. They did a significant after action review where they collected a lot of observations, not just from emergency managers, but from all sorts of people involved, national parks, tourists that were there, people who are involved in tourist operations, people who are involved with the animals before the unfortunate fires. and so on. A large number of people. We also had a significant fire
That,
on
that brings up a
Fraser
good
Island.
question.
Mm.
That with lessons learned, whether you're having a workshop or whatever the case may be after the fact, who should be involved? Because
The
a
more the
lot of
merrier.
times it's a small little group who get around and, you know, excuse the language, but bitch and gripe, you know, about things. So who really should be involved with after action reviews or lessons learned workshops, or, you know, whatever term you want to call them? Who should be
Oh,
involved?
sometimes when you've got senior people in the room, you probably want to keep it fairly tight. But you can, of course, open up these reviews to a wider group. And they certainly did that with the Fraser Island fire. So they involved a whole lot of academics because there were research stations on the island, a lot of Aboriginal people because there are all sorts of Aboriginal sites that had to be protected. There's a big tourist operation there. Fraser Island's the largest sand island in the world, so it's very popular with the tourists. There's all sorts of people that wanted to put their 2 cents worth in and share their observations. So some of those were done by community meetings subsequently. So the operational elements relating to the fighting of the fire and some of the challenges were largely handled fairly in-house, but the broader implications of the fire to the general community of Fraser Island and beyond, they were given, I think it was 6 community meetings where they had an opportunity to, as we would say in Australia, put their 2 cents worth in.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
I think that's an interesting point you just brought up, that I know from my project management years and even some business continuity years that a lessons learned workshop is one. It's not multiple. And you just kind of touched on something I think is important, that a lessons learned isn't a one-time thing. It can be multiple meetings and sessions, right?
Absolutely. And if it's big enough, you know, like those fires on Kangaroo Island and on Fraser Island, it's very wise to involve more people because, as I've often said, everyone will bring a different insight. So when I conduct my exercises with clients, I do what I call a hot wash debrief before we leave the exercise room. But I also encourage them to have a structured, facilitated debrief within 30 days of a real incident, because not everyone is an extroverted person who'll happily speak up quickly after an incident. Some people need time to think about it, and perhaps more insights will come to them at a quieter moment. You know, there's the old, I used to have a boss that came and said, "Now I was thinking about this in the shower this morning." And I used to, "Oh, really, boss? Do I have to think of that image? Oh my God." But, you know, there are people like that who need time to consider. And that's the beauty of something like bringing more people in and giving them time to consider, and you'll get a richness of data. And of course, you will collect a lot of data. And fortunately for me, one of my first degrees included qualitative sociology, so I'm quite accustomed to large amounts of narrative data that has to be collected and organised and collated and analysed.
Is that to make sure that there's a difference between the emotional response and the, I don't want to say logical response, but a more informed, thought out response? Because I know in some lessons learned, it can become very emotional depending on what the situation was. But sometimes those emotions dictate the findings, and they're not always the right findings.
Indeed. And that's why I recommend, if it's a significant incident, to do the hot wash debrief before people leave the room, before you stand down your team, but also to structure another opportunity within 30 days of the incident for that reflection, for that opportunity to reflect. And if it's a major community incident, as we had with Kangaroo Island and Fraser Island, to engage with the community and not just think it's the people that run around with the fire hoses and the helicopter and air assets and all this fancy stuff. Right. What about the people on the ground whose communities have been burnt out, whose tourism businesses have been burnt out, whose livelihoods have vanished, Aboriginal people whose traditional custodianship has been put in jeopardy because of the damage due to fires, these sort of things. These are people who have insights to share, and we must understand those insights in order to do better with emergency management moving forward.
Okay. So
And
go ahead.
last thing, disseminating. Coming back to those lessons, you may not be capable of moving a lessons identified into the lessons learned column. And we might be getting close to a commercial break by now.
Oh, just keep going. Just keep going.
Okay. So to give you an example of that, in Australia, we've recently had a very serious hack, cyber hack of one of our major telecommunications providers. I think in Canada, your big one is Rogers, isn't it? Isn't that one of yours? In Australia,
well, it wasn't a hack, but it was a big major outage. Yes.
Yeah. Well, we had them. Somebody hacked it. And they grabbed a whole lot of personal identification details that are required to get a SIM card in Australia to put it into your phone. You have to provide what we call 300 points of identification. So that involves things like your driver's license, your Medicare card, which is issued by the government here for health assistance, your passport, and all sorts of valuable information if you're a cyber criminal that you can sell on the dark web, and which these kindly people released 10,000 records and have apparently impacted on 40% of the Australian adult community.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a big one. Now, the Australian Cyber Security Centre, which is part of the Australian Signals Directorate, which is part of the Australian Defence Force, are after these sorry creatures, along with our friends from the Australian Federal Police and now the Federal Bureau of Intelligence in the US. So we've got everybody after these people. Boy, I hope they find a good rock to hide under, because everybody's after them. Now,
I hope they don't find a good rock.
Yes, I look forward to them executing a nice search warrant and dragging them out of the house in handcuffs. That'd be very nice.
Yeah.
I used to be a police officer. I rather like bringing criminals to justice. And I think this lot might discover just how much justice they're going to get. And of course, recent incidents in America with your Colonial Pipeline and what was the other one? JB Meatworks. Yep, they got them. And they got some of the money back from their ransomware demands too, no less. But my point here is with the Optus incident, the release of data onto the dark web, the lessons the dealing with the actual criminal behaviour will be by the ACSC, the ASD, AFP, and so on that I mentioned earlier. But they won't have the capacity to make the necessary changes. So they may identify the lessons, but they may not have the capacity legislatively to make the necessary changes so that those lessons move across to the lessons learned column and we actually do things to protect Australian data better. And that would come under the auspices of the Attorney General and the Department of Communication, who actually issue licenses to the telecommunication providers here and specify the conditions under which they will operate. So there's an example of where one group, ACSC, the Australian Cyber Security Centre, may identify some of the lessons, but other groups will actually have to take those lessons forward so that they're learned and so that we make the necessary changes to protect data moving forward.
Well, how do you circle back on that? Let's use you and I as an example. I identify some lessons learned from an incident that I've experienced, and I pass that off to you. How do I know that you're actually doing something? How do I, at the end of the day, do I feel ignored, or do I feel as though something is going to happen? Because as you mentioned, lessons learned means change. Yes. In the end, it means change. So how do we keep that going Is there a trick to that? Is there some way, a communication vehicle that should happen between you and I?
And that's why I put incident and exercise registers into my business continuity plans. And they're assessed by the Risk and Audit Committee, which in Australia generally reports to the CEO or the deputy CEO or someone with real teeth. They have independence, and they usually, within their charter for risk and audit committees, have business continuity. So when I used to be an internal business continuity manager, I would report twice a year, once with exception reporting and once with a more fulsome report, which would capture these lessons. And I would actually report on what lessons had been moved from identified to lessons learned column. If they were incomplete, I would provide a commentary about that I had liaised with my colleague Alex here, who works, say, back to that example of the Optus. I might be working for ACSC, you might be working for Attorney Generals on privacy and such matters, protection of data, public data information, and how we would do that better. And before that meeting with the Risk and Audit Committee, I would be in touch with you saying, where are we, Alex? Have you sent the necessary amendments to Parliament House, which is the image behind me? I used to be their business continuity manager. So, and then I would continue to report until it was closed off, or as I mentioned earlier, until that lesson had been superseded by developments in the business or a new approach to dealing with that challenge.
Okay, I was just kind of curious, if because I've seen it happen, especially in large projects. When they end, they always have a lessons learned at the very end, and within a month or so. But by then, half the staff is gone. They hold the lessons learned, and things just kind of go off into the netherworld. And the next project comes along and they repeat the same mistakes or encounter the same challenges, and they never really actually learn anything.
Well, we have project management offices in most Australian government agencies and departments, and we have a project management office in the Prime Minister's Department. They keep an eye on these things, so the lessons are captured and dealt with, so that there is a register of these lessons and their status.
Well, that's good to hear. I wish others would do that. Organizations, communities, everybody. I wish they would all do that properly.
Yeah.
Now you had before we started recording, you had a great example that illustrated what your last point was about capturing lessons learned in a large setting with a bunch of people. The gentleman, well, I don't want to give anything away, but you mentioned the example. Could you kind of mention that here, because I thought that was rather
sure. And that was the Kangaroo Island fire. And I mentioned that we have these lessons management forums, which is how a lot of emergency managers and business continuity managers in Australia were first exposed to these ideas of OIL through those lessons management forums conducted by ADARE, the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience. And their most recent forum was held, I think it's March, in Brisbane, and hybrid. And it's very modest if you want to join in. I think it costs about $258 for 2 days. So it's very modestly priced for people all over the world to dial in. Anyway, what impressed me by that was a number of very senior people had actually been much involved and very seriously involved in these lessons projects. And one of them included the Kangaroo Island fire, where there'd been considerable public commentary about the performance and that it wasn't good enough and all sorts of things. A lot of the people who make the commentary, of course, have never held a hose and never tasked anyone to do anything in emergency. So, yes, armchair experts, as we would call them in Australia. But in capturing the observations, they came out with about 6,000, more than 6,000 observations from the many sources we talked about earlier. They gradually refined those down into something of the order of 20-something lessons. And it was interesting, the senior manager that tasked this review, this lessons review activity, was asked, did they wish to be interviewed at the start of the project by the consultants undertaking the project to just get their perspective? And the answer was, no, you should interview me last, because I don't want to influence the direction of your work. I want you to be sharing the lessons that you have identified through the time in the field that you've had, both with my members, but also with other people who are more than disinterested spectators, who are very key stakeholders. What were their observations? What could we learn to do better for them in the future? And so it takes, in my view, a courageous manager, because what comes back from these reviews may not cast your organisation in a very favourable light. And there may be a very long list of things that need to be changed. I mean, most of my exercises, I worked with one client for 5 years until I told them to sack me, because I feel that, you know, after 5 years, they need different eyes on their organisation, and that I wouldn't be helping them further. And they were so good in their crisis management team that other business continuity managers wanted to come and observe them. And the last after action report I wrote for them was had 13 pages of things that they could still do better. So even when you're really good at this stuff, there's still things that an incident, an exercise, an near miss can bring to the attention of your organisation. But you have to be courageous. You have to have a courageous owner, a courageous leader, willing to, well, put their head on the chopping block potentially, that things were not done as well as they should have been.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. We are talking about lessons management, O.I.L.L in particular, with Chris Miller, and we will be right back. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.